I'm Dr. Mark Brannon. I'm the president of the Princeton Adult School, and I welcome all of you here at the end of a long semester and during a busy time of the year for the holidays coming in. So thank you very much for coming tonight. I hope that you've enjoyed this semester as much as I have, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about what we're hoping to do for next semester. This is always a great pleasure of mine towards the end of the previous semesters to be able to give you at least a brief glimpse of what's going to be presented, and we hope to see all of you and many of your friends or other relatives who would be interested. Some months ago, a few of us on the board of the adult school sat down with the university president, Shirley Tillman, and President Tillman was most helpful, I must tell you. It's just an incredible help in making recommendations to us with regards to speakers that she knows from our faculty, or from her faculty, I should say, in the general theme of science and developments in science. And with a list of a number of professors, a few of us then went back and called them and said with just a little bit of understatement, President Tillman has recommended that you should. And literally, I think we had the whole semester filled within a couple of days' time. So the topic in general is about science, and we've titled the topic for next semester, Science Times, Exploring the Frontiers of Science. So it'll be science and then things that are in the cutting edge, if you will, the developments of science, and how many of the faculty here at the university are really doing some seminal work in many fields, and with the headliner that President Tillman has also agreed to speak to us. So yeah, and she's done that before. She gives of her time tremendously. We have a little one-paragraph summary of the topic, and I'll read that to you so you get an idea of where the subjects might be. Scientific advances are intricate and also elegant. Come and hear some of Princeton's distinguished scientists and researchers discuss their work. Reports from the laboratories, observatories, and field stations will help us understand recent advances in areas as diverse as the human genome and the birth of the universe, as well as the policy implications of these discoveries. So just as a little bit of a teaser, let me tell you some of the names and topics that people are going to be presenting for next semester. We are, by the way, also starting it after Valentine's Day. Because of scheduling issues, we're not going to start our next semester until the 21st of February. Somebody asked us up there coming in when the first class would be. And that first class will be taught by, or will be given by Colleen Murphy, who's assistant professor of molecular biology, on what we can learn about aging from one of her research areas. Daniel Sigmund, who is a geologist here, will talk about the ocean's role in carbon and climate. Ali Yazdani, who's a professor of physics, will speak on high temperature semiconductivity and energy related to that. Manuel Linnaeus, who's an associate professor of molecular biology, will talk about combating malaria. It's still a terrible scourge around the world. Then Mala Murphy, an assistant professor of molecular biology, will talk about neural basis for sensory perceptions from the studies that are being done on that area. Then President Tillman will give a lecture on genomic imprinting. And the two last speakers, Stuart Prager, who is the director of the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, has also agreed to speak to us on the path to fusion energy. And the very last one is David Spergel, professor of astrophysical sciences, and he'll be talking on simplicity to complexity, the history of our universe. So you see, it's going to be a wide open, tremendous area of development in science. So let's get on to tonight's issue. The reason that you're here. It's really a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Professor Lawrence Rosen. Professor Rosen is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Anthropology here at Princeton, where he has taught since 1977. And also, since 1979, he's been an adjunct professor of law at Columbia Law School. So you can see he has two hats at least, anthropology and law. Coming from Cincinnati, Ohio, he earned his undergraduate degree at Brandeis and both his PhD and his law degrees at the University of Chicago. As an anthropologist, he has worked mostly in North Africa on Arab social life and Islamic law. And as an attorney, he has worked mostly on the rights of indigenous people and American socio-legal issues. And that really brings him to tonight's topic, and he'll expand on that as we hear. He's a member of the Bar of the State of North Carolina and the United States Supreme Court, and he was named to the first group of MacArthur Award Fellows, and that's what is commonly called as the Genius Awards. He's held grants from the Guggenheim, the National Endowments for Humanities, and the National Science Foundation. A member of Commons at Wolfson College, Oxford, and a visiting fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study here in Princeton, also at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and the American Bar Foundation. He's been Phi Beta Kappa lecturer and visiting professor at Ben-Gurion University, and at least the three following law schools, Northwestern, Georgetown, and the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Rosen spent the year of 2006 to 7 in Washington as a fellow of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and as a Carnegie Corporation Scholar. In 2009 and 10, he was a Mellon Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. Here at Princeton, he's also received a very coveted award, which is the President's Distinguished Award for Teaching. And he's also received the Ombudsman's Award for Civility, the President's Committee on the Status of Women Award, and Princeton University Women's Organization Award. He's written so many books I won't be able to detail them all, but one of the books is on the Justice of Islam, another is the Culture of Islam, so his interests are in that area for sure. His articles have appeared in the American Scholar, the Times Literary Supplement, the London Review of Books, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and op-ed pages for the New York Times, the LA Times, and the International Herald Tribune. He's currently writing a book on the intellectual lives of 4 Moroccans entitled Drawn from Memory, Arab Lives Unremembered. Tonight's topic, and the concluding topic for our Curators Collections on the Visual Arts, is titled The Right to Cultural Property and the Arts of Native North Americans. Please join me in welcoming Professor Larry Rosen.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Do feel free to repeat it to Shirley Tillman. As for example, it's our review time. I'm also very well aware that at this hour of the day what you would really like to do is to take a nap, and I do know how to deal with that situation. I learned that in law school, where they were still telling the story of guys who had come to law school after the Second World War, and they weren't going to take any nonsense from some paper-chase law professor. Apparently one day in class, one of the veterans fell asleep, and the professor stopped in mid-sentence, looked at the veteran seated next to the sleeping figure, and said, "Would you kindly wake that gentleman up?" Well, the vet had been through the Second World War. He wasn't taking any of this guff. He looked the professor square in the eye and said, "Begging your pardon, sir, you put him to sleep, you wake him up." So I let sleeping students lie. Actually, a topic I want to talk with you about tonight is a little different, a little broader than the way it was originally announced. I want to talk with you about the metaphors that we use thinking about indigenous peoples' productions. Metaphors, it may seem to you, is something that people just from the English Lit department should be talking about. We'll even talk about them as mere metaphors. But I'm going to suggest to you they are absolutely crucial, not only in law and politics and in the rights of indigenous peoples, but in a whole host of ways theoretically. Just think of some of the kinds of metaphors that we live by. We talk about a marketplace of ideas. Is there an invisible hand? Is there a behavioral economics theory that should go with that particular metaphor? Think of all the biblical ones that we used: salt of the earth, filthy lucre, skin of one's teeth, sour grapes, feet of clay. All of these kinds of images connect what we think we know with what we're trying to make some sense of. They have enormous implications and resonances across domains. It sounds perfectly normal for us to talk about time flying like an arrow. You cannot, as Woody Allen said, you cannot say that time flies like a banana. It just doesn't work. But of course, we think that we progress. We think we look to the future. We think straight is the path. If you were an ancient Greek or a Mayan, you would think that you back into the future because all you can see by way of guidance is the past. Imagine trying to run for office in this country saying, my fellow countrymen, vote for me as I lead you backwards into the future. The image would not resonate in the least. We now talk about a corporation as a person. We talk about the economy, quote, gaining traction. One congressman, obviously opposed to certain welfare laws, said that we shouldn't refer to it as a safety net, but as a hammock. And if you look even today in some of the textbooks in medical school, you will see that a woman's egg is referred to with all sorts of virginal and recumbent images. It has vestments, it has a corona. If you look earlier, not so much earlier, at the history of kleptomania, you'll find that women, when they became the primary consumers for the household in the Victorian age, the department store was developed for them, because you couldn't have women walking on the street. They would be streetwalkers. So you brought them into a contained place where they had Main Street and all the departments of the department store. Problem was, some of these middle-class ladies started pinching things. Well, you can't throw middle-class ladies in the pokey, so what you do, as the Victorians did with all sorts of things, male circumcision, many other kinds of things, you find a bodily place for this. So only women could be kleptomaniacs. Go to the DSM, the Desk Manual for Diagnostics, as recently as 20 years ago. You'll see that kleptomania is defined as something that only women suffer from. But because they had to find a bodily place for it, they actually referred to it as uterine insanity. And if you go even to some of the contemporary textbooks in obstetrics and gynecology, you will find reference not only to menstruation as the weeping of the womb, but you will find that women who have a tendency towards spontaneous abortion, miscarriages rather, are referred to as having an incompetent cervix. So metaphors are all around us all the time and have tremendous repercussions because the way in which you make your analogies may guide the way in which all sorts of implications flow from it. For an anthropologist, it becomes also very crucial. I won't try your patience with too much of this, but metaphor, I think, is our way of connecting lots of different domains together. And that's the trick that culture plays on us. Culture is really this capacity that we developed in our evolutionary history to create the categories of our own experience, and to in generating them, to knit them across multiple domains so that they seem to us both obvious and commonsensical, indeed as natural. So metaphors have a lot of implications, and I want to talk with you about their implications specifically for indigenous peoples, both in this country, we'll talk a little bit about Australia, New Zealand, a couple of other places, because the way in which you conceptualize their things, it's hard not to find some metaphor you will see, may make all the difference in the world. Are you going to think of it, for example, as property? We've come to think of intellectual property. It's an almost commonsensical thing, like time flies like an arrow. It is property. It is something you own. Well, that has various implications. If you look at any object that you've got with you right now, and I just arrived from Mars, and I say, well, you say you own that. What do you mean by that? You'll probably say things like, well, I can sell it or lease it. I bought it in the first place. I can dispose of it in a variety of ways, but obviously there are limitations. You can't set fire to it in this building. You can't poke me in the eye with it. If you don't pay your taxes, Uncle Sam may take it away from you. There are all sorts of limitations on your, quote, owning it as property. But that's enough if you think of it in terms of it's my relationship to this thing. But you could also conceptualize property, even in our own system very much, in terms of it being not your relationship to that thing, but your relationship with me and others as it concerns that thing. Now the focus is on our relationship vis-a-vis the object, not on your attachments to the particular object. So even if you're going to use an image like indigenous cultural property or intellectual property, whether it's indigenous peoples or others, which kind of conception of property you're dealing with may have very different implications. You can also think of it as a kind of moral right. It's very interesting. I'm not sure if this is still true. Maybe somebody here will be able to tell me in the discussion. But if you look in the copyright page, particularly of books from Great Britain, until very recently, and I think this may still apply, it says that the moral right is reserved to the author. Now that's an interesting, it doesn't say the property. The moral right, well, you could imagine that if this is somehow a production of mine, and in a sense is something about me, then you could say that I have a moral right for you not to screw around with who I am. I mean, remember that dopey thing you made in summer camp and you looked at it afterward and said, that's me, that's moi, that's, you know, that's a piece of me. Well, if you think that your book or your song or your production is an expression of yourself, then you have a moral right, perhaps, not to have other people change your image vis-a-vis others or indeed of yourself. You may even think that what you've got here is a moral right in the sense of a very deep, almost religious sort of sense. But if you use that image, notice how, as opposed to property, which doesn't necessarily have direct connections, though it certainly could, to the religious, putting things in moral terms may very well do so. You could also think of property as implying various other kinds of images, and these are ones that do take place in lots of respects in this whole field. I have to keep calling it intellectual property, although I want to keep putting the property part in quotation marks for the moment. You can think, for example, of people who can pirate what you have. How is piracy going to convey a sense of ownership of a very individualized sort of nature, as opposed to, as we'll see in a second, something that's much more collective, much more communal. There are people who talk about intellectual property as being like a crop in an unfenced field. I mean, this is in the literature of the courts as well. Well, did the seed come before the sowing? From whom does this come? If you imagine that what you are doing is reaping something, then you might want to say, but where did the seed for this whole thing come from? It wasn't started by me. Maybe it's communal. Maybe I'm just the most recent expression of it. Maybe what I add is a bit of something to something that is collective as a whole, and not something that's entirely of my own product. Or think of the image that we will sometimes use of you stand on the shoulder of giants. Well, should the artist have a continuing interest in something that is sold? Should the artist community have an interest in the production that is at once unique from that artist, but on the other hand may be using symbols, expressions of the community as a whole, who, if you're then going to use property-like metaphors, quote-unquote, owns it in the first place. So using property as a construct may destroy the distinctiveness of the cultural use, but at the same time, it may allow the group to forestall commercialization of various things. Again, a very important implication of which metaphor you might choose. Copyright also protects a particular tangible form and its original expression, but copyright and patents have some interesting features, if that's going to be your analogy. For a patent, you have to add something significant to what is naturally there. For a copyright, you get it for a period of time, after which it becomes everybody's. So already you're conceptualizing in these things analogically images of time, images of what is an addition to something else. And I'll show you some very concrete examples involving indigenous peoples that really problematize all of this. Let me tell you about a couple of cases very briefly. In Australia, there's a case called the Bulum Bulum case. An artist had used some images from this Australian Aboriginal tribe, which the tribe said he had no right to use and sell individually. The court, in a very curious opinion, said that the man did have an obligation, a fiduciary obligation, is the way they put it, to the tribe as a whole, the clan in this particular case, to at least make it clear to them what he was using, how he was using it. And the court, while not deferring to the Aborigine people's own customs on ownership of these kinds of things, did look at their ways of dealing with this as relating to the facts in the case, what actually occurred and what kind of deference was given by this individual to the group as a whole. In this particular case, they felt that he had made appropriate gestures to them, but the implication of their cases is curious, because it says on the one hand that the group may own the thing as a whole, but an individual can take part of it and then sell it, but must at the same time at least acknowledge that the group has some rights, inform them, discuss it with them, maybe make some arrangement with them. What the court did throw out was a claim on the part of the Aborigines that this particular symbol, and set myths and the like, was very much related to their claims to their own land. This was a kind of charter in this myth and through these symbols to their claims to the land. The court threw that claim out, and that's interesting because you might see the symbol as carrying their history, as carrying their claim to various things. And you get much the same sort of situation with Native American groups who, finding a sacred symbol stuck on their state license plate, not only violative of their sense of their own religion, but also, very often, these particular symbols not only are used out of context, but these are secret, sacred knowledge. These are things that belong to the people and lose their meaning if they're not part and parcel of the rituals that they engage in, or learning enough as you grow up in that culture to be able to use these in the correct way. And there you have either something stuck on a license plate or something stuck on a ball cap that's being sold to people that is religious, but it's also carrying the knowledge of the people as a whole, and it's being claimed as something belonging to the people as a whole. Try this for yourselves. Who owns the cross? Who owns the American flag? Who owns the Star of David? And yet you can, in the pit of your stomach, feel that there are highly inappropriate uses of it. And of course, I teach here on blasphemy, hate speech, and pornography. Trust me, the kids are not there for the blasphemy part. You know, I show them Serrano's picture of a crucifix dipped in a vat of urine. And I'm not just trying to shock them. Frankly, I don't seem able to shock them. But I want them to understand why people would be offended in this regard, why Muslims could be offended by some of the passages in Salman Rushdie's satanic verses, why any of us might be, and yet how will you conceptualize who, quote unquote, owns this kind of symbol? There are other kinds of cases that, of course, and not just cases, that use other sorts of images. So we've got a moral sort of right, we've got property, we've got also the notion, you've probably used the phrase yourself, this thing was my brainchild. again, that might convey very different sort of things, part of personality rather than simply of ownership. Or you may refer to these things as heritage. And cultural heritage, cultural patrimony, is a very different way of conceptualizing what we or native peoples might imagine to be their connection with the products of their culture. You may even look at particular kinds of things, even like hunting. When the Makah Indians in the northwest coast recently went hunting for whales once again, this was not just an economic activity, it was very much an expression of a particular aspect of their culture, and the question of whether or not they might legally be permitted by the United States to engage in the hunting of whales became a huge issue. Similarly, when you get textiles or other motifs and designs that are not necessarily protectable under American law, you will often find indigenous people whose own customs and laws are intended to protect these things, and then you're in this situation of a kind of internal colonialism, a kind of paternalism on the part of the state. And yet, and this is something we might discuss, if one conceptualizes their stuff in terms, say, of property, the analog to property, you might say, well, there's a benefit to that, because if you analogize it to property rights, you're also going to be connecting it to property rights as they relate to lots of people and lots of kinds of situations. So you might get past some of the paternalism, colonialism aspect of the thing by your native rights being connected to the rights of everybody else. At the same time, you may find many indigenous peoples who say, no, it's got to be according to our own rights and our own customs for conceptualizing these kinds of matters. Again, this can arise even within a community. In the Chilkat case from the northwest coast, an individual member of the tribe sought to sell an object that the tribe claimed was part of its cultural heritage and patrimony. She said, it belonged to my grandfather, it's mine, 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 I'm an American, I get to sell the thing. The tribe said, no, 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 it is part of our collective patrimony and must stay with us. Well, just think of the analogs to the objects that are in the British Museum that were bought, taken, stolen, borrowed, to pick your own words, from the Greeks, belong to the Greeks. If somebody managed somehow to purchase, I don't know, the original copy of the Declaration of Independence and wanted to take it back to England or somewhere, where do you feel that the United States, whatever else you might say about the, quote, ownership of the thing, the person might be limited in where they could take it, maybe even in the way in which they could treat it. So it's not so hard to come up with analogs from our own non-native situations. Again, when one speaks of things like myths, stories, songs, sacred sorts of things, should a native group be able to bar an anthropologist or historian who's learned some of these things from actually publishing them? You often get into this awkward situation where native peoples will come into an American court, say, and ask for, sue for, right of access to a sacred site, and the court will say, where is it? And they'll say, we can't tell you. It's a sacred site. It's secret. Well, how do you know that it is a sacred site? That's secret. I can't tell you that. Well, there are people here perhaps who belong to the Masons. The idea of secret knowledge is not totally unknown to us, and you can imagine the difficulty one gets into when there's this kind of incommensurability among these systems of conceiving of who has rights to what kinds of things. I think this notion of moral rights is particularly intriguing. The Berne Convention back in 1928 spoke in those terms. Others, the French, talk about moral rights. They also speak in Germany about personality, and the British, as I said, of moral right. notice that these are very different analogies that you would be drawing, and they might have very different kinds of implications. Surely another way of thinking of this would be in terms of human rights and international conventions even on human rights. Do you have a right to your culture? Does your culture, if I can anthropomorphize it a bit, have a right to its integrity? What kinds of attacks may be made on it in terms of taking away certain of your, again, I don't like any of these terms, but you know what I mean, belongings or productions. Think, for example, of some of the things that have more recently come up that may sound a little bit strange in certain ways. Genetic material. We have lots of researchers, drug companies, going out to areas of indigenous people's territories, and in some instances, with permission, obtaining blood and DNA from these people, which they are researching for various kinds of medical purposes. Now, at what point, for them, for any of us, is that still yours? What part of you do you own, if you want to put it in property-like terms? You can, in this country, basically, you can sell your hair, your sperm, your eggs, your blood. You cannot sell an organ, at least not yet. You can give it, and we'll even talk about sperm donors or egg donors, even though those things can be sold. Well, which bits and pieces of you do you control as property-like in order to be able to sell? When a researcher comes along and gets some of your blood or DNA, in order to patent it, and you can patent some of this stuff, you again have to add something, transform in some way what's there naturally in order to be able to make such a claim. Now, many indigenous people think that this is colonialism all over again. They're taking our blood, they're manipulating it for their purposes, they're selling it. It is vital to who and what we are, and we have no control once they get this stuff or what they do with it. And it wasn't even necessarily that they lied to us as to what they're going to do with it. Sometimes the researcher doesn't quite know what the research may later turn up, but what, quote, rights do these people have, do you have, in these materials later on down the line? In the case of indigenous peoples, this may also, very frequently now, involve plants and other such materials in their environment, which a pharmaceutical company in particular, but sometimes even food industry people, want to use and transform in various ways. Some of these are really quite vital historically. We got aspirin from the bark of a tree that the native peoples knew had the effects that it does. I strongly suspect that aspirin has saved more lives in the world than maybe any other medication. What if a native people in their reserve, in their territory, had a plant that cures cancer? What right would you have to it if they say, no, it's ours, 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 and it's a sacred thing, and we're not giving it to you? Would you have a demand right to access it? If you landed on Mars and the Martians said, go away, by what right would you be able to stay there? In all of these situations, you're not only going to have to think legally and politically about the distribution of rights and powers, but again, you're going to have to think about which metaphor defines the ways in which these kinds of rights are going to be distributed. All of this can arise in other instances, with music, with dance even, certainly with folklore. A hip-hop group, I have to read this because I ain't exactly into hip-hop. I can tell you are. When the hip-hop duo Outkast, that's spelled with a K, used a Navajo sacred song, it caused tremendous outrage among the Navajo. New Zealand has a law that allows the Maori to sort of register these things and get protection for them. We do not have such a thing. And again, if you want to find the right analogy, or an analogy, do you want to do this in terms of cultural patrimony, heritage? Do you want to do it in property-like terms? In New Zealand, Lego, again, I don't play Lego with Lego things, so you guys will maybe understand more about this than I do. They started using a bunch of Maori names for various objects of Lego, and the Maori tribal groups threatened legal action against Lego for allegedly trademarking their words to sell their product. This is one of these situations in which, after Lego sent the guy to New Zealand to try to negotiate with the Maori, they came to an agreement, and that does happen in a number of these instances. But in some others, the agreements don't ever come about. You are all familiar with sports teams that use Native American names or terms that many Native Americans find extremely offensive. Imagine instead of Chief Illini coming out at halftime in a basketball game at the University of Illinois, a figure regarded by the native peoples as a sacred figure and dancing around the court. Imagine that instead we're, oh, I don't know, let's say a game at Notre Dame or against Notre Dame, and the figure that's brought out is a nun in full flying habit or a priest dancing around it. Wouldn't you feel a little bit as, but who owns that image, that object? Quite aside from civility, and the people in Illinois will tell you we're honoring the Indians. And when we do a tomahawk chop in Atlanta or whatever it is, we're honoring these. Or is it a kind of cultural cannibalism? Surely you can understand from these people, the native people's perspective, that they might be deeply offended. But more than that, how are you going to analogize, conceptualize who has what kinds of rights to these kinds of things? I mentioned medicines and plants and things of that sort. There's a very interesting dispute that's gone on for quite a while with the white earth Ojibwa, who have wild rice that they raise, and others are trying to get it, market it. Again, if it began in their territory and somebody manages to get hold of some of it, or for that matter, it blows over to somebody else's field, is there a kind of property right in this sort of thing? Various international conventions have tried to deal with this sort of thing, and very often, and I could read you numerous such examples I have with me, the indigenous people involved as delegates to these international conventions talk about things in terms of resources, talk in terms of them as knowledge, not as property. They talk about them as belonging to everybody in the group, not as something that is individually ownable. There are some very interesting situations, too, involving oral history. Leave aside the sort of question of, I can't tell you what it is, it's secret knowledge. How do you conceptualize oral history when it comes into a court, for example, in a land dispute involving native people? Do you think of this as history? Do you think of it as myth in a rather negative sort of way? Do you think it has the solidity of a document? Or do you think that it is something that is much more likely to be manipulated or forgotten? Well, it depends on your own tradition. I come from one in which when certain portions of the Old Testament are read, you have to have somebody there with the book to make sure you're sort of getting it right. But it's the oral that is really quite crucial. In Islam, you should memorize the entire Quran and take it into your heart. There will be plenty of people who will correct you if you get it wrong. So it may be more precise than the kind of scrivener's error if you keep copying things over and over again. So why should we regard this as any less history than a piece of documentation from a missionary, a government official, or a historian. I suppose, trying to pull some of this together, that you have to really think, what are the questions that we're actually trying to address then? What is it we might think we're trying to accomplish? What is it one is actually trying to protect in these sorts of situations? Is it the community? Is it the concept of property or genetic material as something private? Whichever of these you choose, and you're going to choose them with some metaphor, is going to make all the difference in the world. And if you think that what is to be protected is knowledge or a community, is there an element of paternalism in the superordinate power in this regard? Again, a kind of cultural game warden sort of situation in which, oh yes, we'll protect them, but of course we're going to protect them according to our standards and our laws and our metaphors and analogies. Remember what my teacher from law school, Harry Calvin, said: competition among analogies is the essential circumstance of legal reasoning. And once you get into our system, you will be competing with alternative metaphors, some of which may certainly not be those of the indigenous peoples themselves. If, in a somewhat different way, what you're trying to do is to set up a system such that people can bargain within its shadow, then again, the analogies and the terms that you set up may influence the shape of the negotiation, or you simply back away and you try to see what are their analogies, what are their metaphors, what are their conceptualizations of these products and things, and can those be translated into ways that are compatible with our own system. Surely that is what has very often happened in our law. Much, if not most, of the First Amendment law in this country has been made through marginal, I don't mean that negatively, religious groups, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, and so on and so forth, Amish, who bring their special circumstance that forces a court to reconsider its foundational concepts, very often metaphorically, extending from the knowledge of their particular situations to rethink some of what is, for the moment, most central. What, in a sense, really is the harm of a kind of cultural appropriation? I mean, are we trying to keep each culture separate? Are we trying to keep it pristine? Are we playing cultural game warden with our laws? And are you trying or going to have the effect, if you talk about something like, say, cultural heritage of the group as a whole, who can then control it as against individual innovators within their own culture, are you going to actually wind up freezing their culture at some particular moment in time? Maybe because you think, gee, that way they'll stay native, and won't that be just swell for a variety of reasons, only you may be keeping them from developing, changing, and especially, not only just in economic ways, but in terms of changing gender roles as well. The metaphors then that we live by really have tremendous consequence. I, as an anthropologist, am suggesting to you that they are one of the most vital aspects that we developed in our evolution. Because if the world is not given to us by instinct, but instead is replaced with a capacity to create the categories of our own experience and knit them together across these domains, then metaphor becomes one of the key vehicles for doing precisely that. And, more obviously, I suppose, which metaphor you choose, marketplace of ideas, etc., may have tremendous repercussions. Think of the heart as a furnace, and you will come up with a different result than if you start thinking about it as a pump. Think of the eye as a beacon, as we did for thousands of years, and you come up with something very different than when you think about the eye as a receptor. Think of the atom as a kind of indivisible, unified entity that can't be broken up, and you get very different results if you think of it as a kind of miniature planetary system. So much of science goes on through metaphor. Max Planck, the philosopher, used to say that science begins with metaphor and ends in algebra, but you can never get to the algebra but you go through the metaphor. One of my former colleagues, Emily Martin, did research in AIDS labs at Hopkins in the medical school. Now, if you think about AIDS, I'll bet that you do think metaphorically in terms of things like it's a battle. It's a bit of a war that's going on between your immune system and this intrusive sort of thing. On the other hand, if you think, and much of the research she was finding proceeded thinking in the metaphor, we've got to find what's battling what. Go to Japan, as she did to the laboratories there, and they're working with a very different metaphor. They're talking about lock and key. They're talking a completely different set of arrangements, and their research is moving down a different kind of line as a result of that metaphor. Or talk to my colleague, Rena Letterman, whose father won the Nobel Prize in Physics, Leon Letterman, and she grew up with this whole Fermi crowd. They were always operating with metaphors because you're trying to grasp what you don't know with what you sort of think you do know, and in this kind of crowd-wise mode of human thought where I've got one foot here and I'm trying to get the other one over here, you're always going to be thinking analogically, metaphorically. That doesn't mean that there ain't no truths out there, and surely most scientists think they chase nature into her corner where she has to give up her secrets, but right along the way, you are operating through metaphors that will lead you in quite different directions and indeed deeply influence what you may even regard as true, much less what is valuable. And in law, that is surely very much the case. Finally, there's a moral element to all this, and I don't mean to sound, moralistic at you, but there is a morality to metaphors, because the ones that you choose can have very different kinds of moral implications. Just as Cardozo said, that metaphors in law are to be narrowly watched, for starting as devices to liberate thought, they can often end up by enslaving it. And Cynthia Ozick has said, referring particularly to a metaphor like, we must greet the stranger in our home because we know what it was like to be in bondage ourselves, is a moral statement of how you must treat the stranger as like yourself and not as some other kind of being. Neil MacGregor, who's the director of the British Museum, also said something very nice at a conference I was at with him last spring. He said the product are not primarily to be seen in the light of context, but as content, as ways of seeing the world. And if you feel that there's a morality to grasping the way in which, say, indigenous people see the world, and being careful not to analogize it, metaphorize it too sharply just in our own terms, especially legally and politically, then that is a kind of moral statement as well. So ultimately, while we're all going to have to sort of choose which metaphors to live by in a world where indigenous products, belongings, property, heritage, all of these conceptualizations are very much more mixed in with our own than they may have been in the past, there is very definitely a morality to which of the metaphors that you choose, and very, very different kinds of legal and political consequences to it as well. On that note, I'd be happy to talk with you all for a bit. Thank you. Please, anyone. Yes, please.
Did Jasper Johns have a moral right to use the flag in his painting?
Right. Can I put that slightly differently? At what point does something belong to everybody such that anybody could use it any sort of which way? Now, you wouldn't ask that question if you had written a poem and copyrighted it and he stuck it in the middle of one of his paintings. You would immediately think, no, 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 that's mine, 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 and you got to at least have my permission, or at least acknowledge that it's mine. But when do certain kinds of again, I can't find a word for these things that isn't going to be some metaphor. The product belongs to everybody in some sense, and then because it belongs to everybody, maybe very different consequences go with it. That anybody can use it, but with respect for the sensibilities and civility that ought to go with something that belongs to everybody, as opposed to something that belongs only to me or nobody. It's hard for us to imagine some of the kinds of situations in which we might be offending people we're not familiar with, but their products may be in exactly the same sort of category as a flag. I had a wonderful moment in Dawes Auditorium with the kids who weren't there to study blasphemy, when I brought a flag in and I took out my matches, and there was this horrified moment when they actually thought I might set fire to the flag. I think more of them were concerned about the sprinkler system than anything else, but I could tell, and they said, you know, there was this visceral moment, you know, where, oh my God, you can't burn a flag. It's a piece of cloth with some red, some white, and some blue on it, you know. Oh no, it's much more than that. And the Supreme Court had to deal with the flag burning case. So you can imagine others' sensibilities in this regard, but at what point is something so generalizable? It's sort of like, you know, when is Kleenex the generalized term for facial tissue so that everybody gets to use it and you don't have to pay a penny every time you use the word Kleenex to whoever the hell it was that started Kleenex. And that might be true with some of the symbols of Native people. It may be true of the flag, but then maybe there are other rules that ought to then kick in about respect, civility, dignity. And the problem is always when there's either not broad agreement about what those forms of behavior ought to be, or there's direct conflict about it, and then, alas, alack, we really got to sort this thing out. You're going to wind up sorting it out in some sort of metaphorical sort of way. So yeah, I think he gets to use it, but I would be really mad if he used some of my symbols in ways that deeply offended me. I mean, I'll say it's art. If I can put it in that category, maybe I can be less offended. But I'm not so sure about that even for me. Please.
Yeah, just recently I read that there are a group of artists, I think in the city, who are making a case that that if you have a piece of your work has sold and then continues to sell because of the art market today increasing values of things, that they are entitled to a certain percentage.
Right.
Is there legal grounds?
No, good luck. I mean, let me put that differently. You know, get the contingent fee up front, okay? You know, because that's probably a loser as things stand. But if I conceive of this thing as my brainchild, if I conceive of it as a moral right, now maybe you will say I'm entitled to some of the subsequent profits. Maybe you will say instead, you cannot alter it in certain ways. Now, I may have contractually made sure that didn't happen in the first place. The library at the law school in Chicago was designed by Eero Saarinen. When they wanted to change the carpet, they had to get the permission of the estate. Okay? Guy had a good lawyer. Okay? But the place was kind of unlivable, not just because of the carpet. I mean, you know, the seats were all wrong. Well, maybe they said a lot about the law school. They all faced away from each other. Okay, so nobody could look at this. Never mind. Point is, you may be able to protect something, and by the way, you may allow certain things to be protectable by contract and other things not. You certainly can't contract to be an indentured servant or a slave. There are limits, just as what you own, to what you can do with what you own. So maybe one of the ways you deal with this is these kinds of international conventions that effectively write a kind of baseline contract as between indigenous peoples and the sovereign within whose territories they live. Or you actually contract individually. Many Native American groups now, and the old saw was, you know, every American Indian family consisted of mother, father, kids, and an anthropologist. They basically require a sort of deal, which I think is perfectly reasonable, which says basically, we get to look at what you're writing before you publish it. We can't stop you from publishing it, but we get to see it first and sort of respond to it. So it's not a kind of right of refusal, but it's a kind of right of, I get to look at this stuff beforehand and give you some feedback on it. And by the way, I don't like it, I may not give you permission to do any more field work on it. I said, why the hell not? So there's, you know, there's a little bit of an iron fist perhaps in that velvet glove, but that's another way of handling it. Now, much of what's happened in Indian country, in this country, in the past generation now, is negotiation. Once, quite frankly, the Reagan appointees took hold in the courts, and particularly in the Supreme Court, and started reversing a lot of things that the Indians had gained since 1958, they began avoiding the courts and not giving them the opportunity to undo things. We may see more of the intellectual property stuff coming under the Native American Grave Protection Act. We now are into the phase not just of the grave stuff, but of cultural property sort of things. All of this is still a bit up for grabs, and just to complicate matters in ways that I am not competent to go into in any detail, as if you wanted me to at this hour of the day, my understanding from my colleagues at the law school is copyright law is a mess. Every time you keep adding, you know, internet and hip hop, I don't know what the hell is going on. Foundational concepts get jumbled, and everybody's out there trying to theorize a general approach to copyright. And what you see is this tremendous flux of different kinds of metaphors and analogies. What the hell is this damn thing like? And you try to attach it to some other part of the law, and then it shakes loose from that. And the field itself is very much up for grabs. The indigenous stuff is complicating that at the same time. Not that you asked it, but thank you for it anyway. I think that it's going to be extremely hard to get away from the image of property. I think most of the analogies will wind up being drawn that way, at least to the extent that the US government, the federal and state courts get to dip into this sort of thing. But there is this counter current, which is very strong in some places, like Australia, New Zealand, and a few other places, Canada, with First Nations, and that is a kind of communal patrimony. And the more that we talk about that in non-native situations, cultural heritage, historical monuments, you know, all those kinds of things, you may find more analogs over there as well. But for the most part, I think we're very wedded to the notion of property, and it's going to be hard for indigenous peoples to get around that. Yes, please, sir.
Two words I'm wondering if you can comment on. Commercialization and satire. How do those enter in and change that? How does the purpose to which something is put change?
Yeah, those are wonderful, wonderful points. There's much more on the commercialization than on the satire, at least from what I know regarding indigenous peoples. And there, within many of these groups, there are differences of opinion themselves. so that there are many Native people who do want to commercialize what they have, or an individual artist among, say, an Aboriginal group wants to be able to sell his design or his stuff, and often finds himself conflicted with his or her own group. At the same time, I suppose if I were to guess, the main propulsion within most of these groups about things like music, legends, folklore, myth, dance, symbols, those kinds of things, the main propulsion is this belongs to everybody and not the outsiders, and no individual from within our group should be allowed to commercialize this without the permission of the group as a whole. And yet, certainly in this country, there's no way of getting around it. Indian country is rife with divisions, and this is one of the places where that shows up. As for satire, I've not heard people talk about, say, the use of non-native people's use of native symbols or mascots or things of that sort as being satires. They think they're honoring them. Nor have I personally ever heard native peoples talk about satirical uses of these things, except in the terms of their own culture. There are trickster figures, and there are rituals of reversal, and there are satires within their own traditions that jumble things up to create momentary chaos in an attempt to reconstruct the world according to normal propositions. Again, it's just like Princeton. I mean, we try to keep them on the street on Friday night, let them turn the world upside down. I mean, somebody asked me, you know, my job description. I said it is to get them from high school valedictorian to members of annual giving. I mean, that's what I do. So you have rituals of reversal that are indigenous forms of these things, but you don't necessarily want the other guy doing it too. But it's a wonderful question. I mean, usually, the examples I'm thinking of, for example, there was a company that started making a beer that was called Crazy Horse Beer. Now, Crazy Horse, who was not only a tribal leader, but something of a sacred figure, was totally opposed to alcohol. So the family brought an action which failed in federal court. They were able to sort of go ahead, it's a complicated case, in tribal court, but an agreement was eventually made and they dropped the Crazy Horse Beer. But there was an example where you could have said that it was satire, but what the beer maker said, as the guys in Illinois will tell you, no, we're honoring the person in this way. Well, think again. Yes, please.
I suspect that many of us have seen the Elgin marbles in the British Museum, and I guess most of us know that the Greek government has made some issues about trying to get them back. What do you see are the issues there, and do you have any personal information about where you think it's going to wind up?
I think they're going to wind up where they are. I think that the provenance of the Elgin marbles, what was the British thing? He speaks as though he held the Elgin marbles in his mouth. It's been a long day, folks. The provenance of those is not one, as I read it, of simple theft, and therefore the fact that the Greeks have built a brand new museum ready to receive all of these things is not probably going to make the difference. The more complicated cases are where that provenance is really very questionable, and if it isn't outright theft, it's very, very close to it. I will just give you one humorous example. Under the Native American Grave Protection Act, various groups are designated within this country as the recipients of Native remains and cultural artifacts. And every institution, like Princeton, museums, required to inventory all their stuff. So we had to do this over in Guyot Hall, where there was a lot of stuff in the back room. And I had received a letter from someone in Hawaii. And he said, he included a Xerox of a page from something published by a geologist on the faculty here in the 1890s, saying that he had collected some skulls of Hawaiian nobles. So, give them back. So we went looking. We were covered with dust. We couldn't find anything. And I'm standing there near the end. And there was a box there. And I'm resting my hand on it. And I said, look, guys, there's nothing. And I'm feeling these round things. So I open the box, and it's full of skulls. Turns out there's a bill of sale inside the box, too. These turn out to be skulls of people who died at different stages of syphilis, which were sold to Princeton University by my beloved former colleague friend Ashley Montague for $40.22 or whatever it was back in the 1950s. So I wrote back to the people and I said, we looked around, we couldn't find anything, and by the way, I helped write that statue. And I got back a letter in Hawaiian. At that time I had a Hawaiian student. And she translated, she said, oh, it now reads completely differently from the first one. It says, oh gracious one, oh light unto the universe, oh wondrous person who has, blessings upon your head for helping do his dwelling. But the point is, you're now required to at least account for all this kind of stuff. I mean, we found a box, a cigar box, with some bone fragments identified as belonging to New Jersey Indians. I had another student. She was an Indian from New Jersey, Lenape. Her uncle was the spiritual head. I went to the then associate provost, Ruth Simmons. I said, can we give them back? She said, sure. I said, it's kind of shabby to give Grandpa back in a cigar, a Garcia y Vega cigar box. Can we at least spring for a box? He said, buy the box already. She didn't quite use a Yiddish accent, but you get the point. Turns out I, who really should have known better, the Delaware Indians of Oklahoma are the designated recipients for the mid-Atlantic states. So we notified them, and they said, no, wait till you give that stuff to those wannabes. They ain't real Indians, and for all I know, there's a cigar box somewhere with bits and pieces. Now we're into this phase with all the cultural property sort of stuff, and it will go to issues like provenance. How did you get this stuff in the first place? Fortunately, all that great Northwest Coast art that we have here was commissioned. Those are not actual burial goods. They were commissioned to be like the burial goods. So we're probably home free there. And I just got to tell you one other wonderful story. I'm told it's true, but I don't really give a damn if it's true. It's too good a story. There was an anthropologist working with a group in the Southwest, and his university owned a lot, or several of these sort of sacred doll figures of theirs. He wanted to do something nice for the folks near the end of his fieldwork, so he got a craftsman to make up copies of these things. And he went to them and he said, I feel really badly. I wish I tried with my university to get them to give you back the real things, but I can't get them to do it. But I got these copies made. I just thought you might kind of like to have these. And they said to him, that's very interesting. Wait here. And they all went off to Rokiva or whatever they did for a little while. And after a while, they came back. And again, he said, geez, I feel really badly. I mean, these are just the copies, and I couldn't get you the originals. And they said, no, no, no. You don't understand. We just held a sacred ceremony. And now the ones in your museum are the copies of
Since the Navajo consider themselves a unified nation,
Yep.
independent of the American form of government or whatever it is, who has jurisdiction in those kinds of cases? The Navajo Nation or American jurisprudence?
Watch the metaphors again. How back in 1830 did Justice Marshall conceptualize Native American political entities, domestic dependent nations, like a ward to a guardian, or later other people talk about the reservation as school. Each of those is going to have very different sorts of implications. Jurisdiction, Holmes said, is power. Absolutely. If I can schlep you into my courts and subject you to my rules, that's power. So jurisdiction on all of these matters is absolutely crucial. By and large, the United States recognizes the Navajo Treaty of 1868, so they are a domestic dependent nation. It means that they can be governed by their own rules, up to a point. Surely they could not have invited Castro to put missiles on the Navajo reservation or run their own foreign policy. But one of the things that made Richard Nixon the great hero in Indian country is that he started the contemporary policy toward Indians of self-determination, which means that they can not only control much more about the sums of money they receive from the federal government and design the uses to which it will be put, but the courts have moved toward recognizing much more jurisdiction in these groups. The Rehnquist court started backing away from that, taking even misdemeanor jurisdiction away from them. Back in the 1880s, this is why it's such a mixed history in this country. The U.S. Supreme Court was faced with a case in which one Indian lay in wait for another who had appropriated the wife of his best friend and killed him. The Navajo said the proper punishment is for him to support the surviving family for the rest of his days. The Fed said, no, 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 the civilized thing to do is to hang him by the neck until he is dead. It went to the U.S. Supreme Court, who said that the sovereignty of the Indians is superior to that of the state. They are not nations, but they are above states. And, of course, Congress, in its plenary power, then passes the Major Crimes Act, which took that jurisdiction away from it. Okay? So one of the problems, let me put it this way generally here, is in this country, if the Indians push too hard, I'm going to put it that way purposely, and get more recognition of their sovereignty, you can always get the congressional backlash. I mean, it makes Donald Trump apoplectic. He says these people can't be running around in three-piece suits and running casinos, they should be dancing in feathers. Okay? And therefore, they're like us and shit, no. And others have tried to get rid of the treaties altogether. Basically, there's this constant flux about jurisdiction on these kinds of matters, no less than anything else. And I think that the current path is one that will probably be followed for some time, and that is making what are called compacts, which are agreements between tribes, states, and sometimes national, including Canadian governments. And in that respect, negotiation may be the most hopeful way out of an awful lot of these kinds of situations.
So thank you very much.